The monetary system of the Fallout 3 universe at first appears to be very different from what we encounter in the real world. The idea of using bottle caps as a form of currency is rather unique, and I like it for its aesthetic quality. However, when we consider its use, we see that it's not really all that different. I would argue that using the bottle caps is akin to using gold as money. This society, like all modern societies, has had one object arise as the primary commodity of exchange. Bottle caps function somewhat similar to gold in many respects. First, there is a definite finite supply of them, just as gold. In this sense, we can see how their value can alter according to the supply of them. For example, since each NPC in the game has a defined amount of caps, the player can theoretically hoard all of the caps through transactions. This would of course leave the wasteland with nothing but bartering. It is a bit different than gold because the game assumes a lot of bartering alongside the use of caps. We do know this: the economy of Fallout is not to the size that would be necessary to require a fiat currency. I sincerely doubt that there would be much in the way of fluctuations in the monetary system that would require an expansion of the money supply. One interesting thing to note was that Marx said money, to be of any real use, had to be the product of labor. This is very true, especially of the gold standard. One could not simply grab a rock that had gold in it. They had to, still do, process it to create the product that we have today as well as back then. Remember that eventually gold had to be set to a fixed purity and weight to ensure ease of use. If money was something we could simply pick up off the ground, it wouldn't have much value, nor would it survive very long as a currency. We would see here that the bottle caps are also a product of labor. Seemingly there is no new production of them. All Nuka-Cola bottles are assumed to be produced pre-war. It seems this is true by people's discussion and the fact that the Nuka-Cola factory in the DC area, in the ruins, has been in ruins since the bomb fell. I sincerely doubt that there is any cross-country trade, given that we know that the Enclave and the Brotherhood of Steel have to send parties out to map new areas. Money, it seems, remains a product of labor, even after the Great War. When researching this, someone brought up the question of counterfeit bottle caps. This doesn't appear in Fallout 3, but it does appear in New Vegas. I know I said I was going to stick entirely to Fallout 3, but this raises an interesting question. In a shack, the player finds a small counterfeit cap shop. What effect would a counterfeit cap have? I think that's a difficult question to answer. The subject of caps as money in general is ill investigated. I can't really say what impact it would have. I think it would have to come down to the question of whether or not people would be willing to accept them. I think that with the greatly expanded economy of New Vegas over Fallout 3, it would require some expansion of money beyond bottle caps. I believe, however, that such a secondary money commodity would also have to be the product of labor. An expected outcome would be that of bimetallism that existed in the US for a period of time. This had a ton of fluctuations in value between the two that caused all kinds of problems. Again, it's nigh on impossible to make a comparison here. We really don't know what would happen. Suffice to say for now, in Fallout 3, bottle caps fulfill all the requirements. Due to the limited knowledge that we have of the universe's commodity production, we assume the Nuka-Cola drinks that the caps come from are no longer produced and must be scavenged. This leaves a very large question as to the supply of the currency. With gold, we always have an estimation of how much gold there is left in the world to find. It's not always accurate, but we do have some measure. Thus, we have some ability to estimate any fluctuations in the supply of them. We cannot do this with bottle caps. The supply will run up sooner or later without any notice. There is no coordinated effort of statistics gathering which would give us an indication of their supply or value. In this situation, I think it would be impossible for someone to speculate on bottle caps, which would eliminate much of the advanced developments in our modern society like collateralized debt obligations and derivatives and speculation. So what can we say would happen here? With the limited ability of caps, it leads us to something Marx wrote very little about: money. In all of Marx's economic works, he wrote very little about money itself. It's one of those subjects he didn't get to before he died. His primary concern when investigating was commodities, their production and distribution. Marx did say specifically, the wealth of those societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails presents itself as an immense accumulation of commodities, its unit being a single commodity. Our investigation must therefore begin with the analysis of a commodity. We do, however, have some information from what little he did write. So what did he write? Anyone can immediately see that the movements of money are bound up with the fate of the movement of commodities. The bourgeois premise is that the movement of money determines the movement of commodities. Marx asserts the opposite, that in fact, it is the movement of commodities that determines the movements of money. We can to a degree acknowledge and take into account the mutual influential or dialectical relationship between the two. However, in order to form a theory, you must still provide a starting point for a theory to be formed. Marx views money as a medium through which commodity exchange takes place, a medium that transmits, but in most cases does not create impulses of spending that originate outside itself. To Marx, the quantities of commodities produced and exchanged, the velocity of the transactions of money, and the money prices of commodities are determined outside the money circulation process. Marx saw that the quantity of circulating money adjusts to suit the quantity equation, which is the opposite of quantity theory interpretation. This idea that money is mostly a transmitting medium as opposed to a proactive distributing element flows with his also unfinished writings on credit and interest. Well, what does all that mean exactly? What's an easy way of putting it? Well, I see it like this. Money does not make demands. Money reacts to demands placed on it. Whenever an economic system requires something of money and it can't perform the task, money must invariably be altered to suit the new use. I believe this is part of what happened to gold as a currency. It could no longer fulfill the demands placed on it by capitalism. Could you imagine an economic system that had complex financial instruments like the previously mentioned collateralized debt obligations and derivatives being traded internationally in physical gold? It would be unable to function. The demands of modern capitalism require money to be far more flexible than a gold standard can be. Thus, we can see that gold as money was historically appropriate for an economy in the past, but not now. The problem is with libertarians and so-called anarcho-capitalists, they have an entirely ahistorical view of money and pretty much everything else. Money must evolve to meet the demands placed upon it by an economic system. I believe the same thing would happen here in the Fallout universe. Bottle caps can only fulfill a historical role in the economy. Once capitalism became developed, bottle caps would no longer suffice as a currency. A fiat one would inevitably have to take its place. Once large-scale exchange and production began to take off, bottle caps would become a hindrance, not an incentive. We cannot see these caps exactly like gold because we do not have a developed capitalist system in which to place these caps. The economies of the Fallout games are not sufficiently developed to the point where its economic needs would exceed that which bottle caps and other currencies are capable of supporting. Thus, we cannot say for absolute certain what would happen with an economy based on bottle caps. We can, however, make estimations based on what we do know of economics. I'd love someday to do an experiment on this to see what would happen. Contrary to bourgeois economic thought, money does not determine the movement of commodities. The movement of commodities determines how money functions. This is not to say they do not have a mutual influence on each other. Of course they do. In this dialectical relationship, the distribution of commodities, i.e. how they are produced and distributed throughout society, is the dominant moment, to use dialectics term. What these bourgeois don't take into account is money is a medium through which commodity exchange takes place, a medium that transmits, but in most cases does not create impulses of spending that originate outside itself. The production of commodities has a particular way of functioning, or mode of production. This is the job of money, to facilitate that system of production and exchange. If at any point money is incapable of doing so, it is altered so that it can. Marx examines the paradoxical nature of the exchange of commodities. The contradictions that exist within the process of exchange provide the structure for social metabolism. The process of social metabolism transfers commodities from hands in which they are non-use values to hands in which they are use values. Commodities can only exist as values for a seller and use values for a buyer. In order for a commodity to be both a value and a use value, it must be produced for exchange. The process of exchange alienates the ordinary commodity when its antithesis, the money commodity, becomes involved. During the exchange, the money commodity confronts the ordinary commodity, disguising the true form of the ordinary commodity. Commodities as use values and money as exchange value are now on the opposite poles and exist as separate entities. In practice, in the process of exchange, gold or money functions as exchange value, while commodities function as use values. A commodity's existence is only validated through the form of money, and money is only validated through the form of a commodity. The dualistic phenomenon involving money and commodities is directly related to Marx's concept of use value and value. The first real money that came into existence was gold. It was almost universally loved for the characteristics that it had. Of course, gold, like all money, required people to want it in order for it to fulfill its role as a means of circulating commodities. This is the primary purpose of money, to make the act of exchange easier to carry out. As economy evolved, money took on other roles and purposes, but this remains the core of its intention. In the process of the development from feudalism to capitalism, some people became very wealthy. This meant that they owned a lot of gold. It presented a problem because they were subject to robberies and all other kinds of monetary-driven violence. Eventually, someone had the idea that the safest place to keep their gold was with the goldsmiths, who had the means to do so. They had huge solid safes where they could safely keep precious metals. People would place gold in these safes and receive a slip of paper that said how much they had there. When they wanted to buy something, they would go to the guild and withdraw that gold. Once doing so, they would receive another slip of paper saying how much they had left, a new balance, as it were. Eventually, along the way, someone noticed that it was going to and from the bank constantly was time-consuming, and it was using up the effort of people at the guild who kept doing the withdrawals and deposits. A new system was devised that made the entire process easier. More and more people started using this service for which the guilds were making a decent profit from. With the new influx of customers, locations that held gold became busier and busier, requiring more and more people to carry out these exchanges. The system they had of exchanging paper for gold was now inefficient. What was happening in society was the growth of the economy. More people had more money and it was being spent more frequently. The velocity of money was now far greater than it had ever been before. More commodities were being exchanged than ever before, and wage labor was becoming more common. The system of commodity production and exchange was evolving, and the current form of money was becoming a hindrance to the process. This inefficiency had to be dealt with. A great thinker made the realization that the guild should make slips of paper that represented a particular amount of gold that was held in their vaults. A person could carry these around instead of just one overall balance. The particular amount of paper would be exchanged for goods and services, which then, at a later time, would be exchanged for gold of the guild. Often, the gold in one area was held by one guild, so that a piece of paper represented a quantity of gold. It didn't have to be exchanged for that gold all the time. People would instead hold onto it and use it in another transaction. The paper was always good because the gold behind it was held in the vault. Now money could move much faster as a person didn't have to go to the guild's vaults so much. This was a very significant moment in history. This was the birth of the bank and paper money that was backed by gold. Guild vaults were replaced with banks. This is the origin of the gold standard that evolved out of the use of gold directly as money. Economy evolved, placing a new requirement on money. In this case, an increased velocity. Gold as money was far too slow for the new speed of exchange. The new paper money worth a particular quantity of gold was the evolution of money to fulfill that new requirement. Money did not make a demand of commodity production and exchange. The opposite happened. Throughout monetary history, this event of alteration in the functioning of economy forced the changes in money. As economic society engaged in new means of production, new means of distributing economies, new forms of money were developed to facilitate them. The financial sector today in our modern society is extremely complex, with its endless mathematical equations and astronomical velocity across entire continents. Physical gold as a money is simply unusable today for several reasons. Let's start by looking at how much gold there is in the world. When we look at the World Gold Council, it says there has been about 158,000 metric tons of it ever mined out of the earth. Divide that by ounces and you get about 50 billion of them. From this, we can determine that it would be 24.4 trillion grains of gold, which sounds like quite a lot. The problem is that we need to divide this by the population of the US to get the most equitable distribution of wealth so we can do an analysis. So if we divide it by the world's population, we get 80,270 grains per person. This number isn't as impressive as the 24.4 trillion, but it leaves more questions as to what this means. What any gold-based system would have to do next is determine how many grains are in a single dollar. Roosevelt set it to about 15.25 grains per dollar, meaning each person would have about $5,259 worth of gold per person in the US. This is assuming, of course, that the US held all the gold in the world. This leaves the US with a money supply of about $1.6 trillion. Even if this fictional scenario were true, it would be totally debunked by the fact that the US has a debt of $16.6 trillion. It would be impossible to pay down the US debt. The claim is that the US would never be in this situation if we had a gold standard, but that's speculation. Right here and now, if the US went to a gold standard, it would be impossible to pay off the debt. This is what libertarians want. It would be impossible to do in our current situation. Change the scenario and assume that there was no national debt and the country operated on the gold standard. The reality is that there's a massive trade deficit, and currently it's about $38.5 billion a month. This means as U.S. capitalism functions, large amounts of the U.S. dollar are being held by foreign nations. At this trade deficit rate, it would take 3.46 years for the entire supply of gold to leave the country. Essentially, the U.S. would end up with no gold-backed money at all. The money would not be coming back because the people who hold that money aren't purchasing enough from the U.S., or else there wouldn't be a trade deficit. The country would be without money. The only logical way out of the situation would be to borrow that gold back into the country again with interest. Doing that would create a debt-based money system again. In researching this book, I've talked to a few people. One question I heard a couple of them ask was, why don't they simply keep using the money that's already there? Indeed, there would have been tons of U.S. federal currency lying around. If people already acknowledge it as having value, then why not just simply keep using it? It makes sense on the surface. The immediate problem is we don't really know what exactly happened immediately after the bombs fell. There could be all kinds of factors that went into decision-making, social and material influences that had an effect. We can, however, make a few logical assumptions based on what we know about economics, or at the very least, we can make some about American attitudes towards currency. The first thing to note would be that immediately after the bombs fell, there would be no use for money. Nuclear blasts have a great leveling effect among rich and poor. A rich man may be able to afford his own vault, but he cannot bring his productive forces with him, which gives him his power. What makes the capitalist class capitalist and gives them their power is the ownership of the means of production. This would be definitely wiped out in the blast, nor can he bring all of his commodities with him. As Marx said, the wealth of those societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails presents itself as an immense accumulation of commodities, its unit being a single commodity. This ownership and production of commodities forms the wealth of capitalist society. It could not have been taken with him into a vault. Everyone pretty much loses all material wealth. Even if there was some odd aberration in this fact that allowed the capitalist to keep his means of production, he would still need to produce and exchange commodities in order to generate his wealth. I don't think there was very much exchange or production going on right away, or even a decade after. People would be faced with the immediate effects of widespread destruction and death. And on top of that, the struggle to survive would become quite immense. These means of production, had they survived, would be useless to the capitalist. This uselessness would cause the capitalist to lose his position as one. The economy would have been wiped out, making money, the means by which commodities and value are exchanged, meaningless. If there is no economy, then money serves no purpose. Money itself is designed to facilitate the function of an economy, not the other way around. Money does whatever a particular economic system requires of it. It has a historical context that forces it to meet the demands of the economy. No economy, no use for money. Money has no value outside of its ability to lubricate the exchange of commodities. If this fails to keep in use, then the money has ceased to have any value. Money has no value outside of its ability to be exchanged for things that have use value. You cannot eat it, you cannot shelter your family with it, nor can it protect you. This is one of the mistakes that gold bugs and cryptocurrency advocates make. Their particular choice of currency is equally flawed in this regard. In the post-apocalyptic situation, both gold and Bitcoin would be equally worthless as US dollars. No currency has any value if no one is willing to trade with it. This is doubly true if there is no one to exchange with and no one is trading. No amount of contradictory subjective value of gold can overcome a lack of exchange. If money can't be exchanged for anything, then the collection of money as a means to its own end is meaningless. I'm not showing up to work if what they're going to pay me with is useless. Let us fast forward a few decades to when the economy began to function once again. We assume a very minimal level of production, nothing that would really constitute capitalism. By this, we mean a system in which one person owns the means of production and employs others in its use. We would be seeing a situation of like primitive accumulation, which one person or even a family produces enough to exchange, meaning their productive capacity has already reached a point where its efficiency can produce a surplus beyond their own need. The productive forces in this case have exceeded producing use values and are now producing exchange values. There is a surplus beyond their own need that is created exclusively for the purpose of exchange. People are now exchanging on a very minimal level, but exchange is taking place nonetheless. Right away, people would be exchanging use values directly. The immediate use value of a commodity would be exchanged for another in an act of bartering. We're assuming a low technological level of manufacture, considering there would be no electricity or complex machinery available. Commodities would therefore be simple and predominantly a product of some degree of skilled labor as opposed to capital-intensive manufacture. At this point, there would be no real use for money. People could simply exchange the products themselves. The situation changes once a larger variety of commodities and more producers comes into existence. At some point, the production of commodities reaches a level of development where the variety of them becomes great. At this point, the material need or want of the consumer will not be immediately available. A trader or producer won't have what the other person needs or wants. This may occur when with the other person as well. Both people will come together to exchange only to find out that each other does not have what the other wants. They both have produced an exchange value, but there's no way to make the exchange if neither has what the other wants. What we need at this point is a universal measurement of value. In other words, we need money. Each product's value would be exchanged for a particular amount of money, which could be taken to another producer in exchange for what the person needs or wants. Money now appears as a necessity in the lubrication of the act of exchange. Money now has a historical necessity. Economy is now placing a requirement on it that did not exist before. Money is serving the active exchange of commodities. The exchange of commodities is determining the function of money, not the other way around, as many ahistorical bourgeois views of money claim. As the economy grows and begins to take on new forms of exchange, new processes in the flow of commodities, money will by necessity alter to serve these new forms. This is where we get the development of checks, debit cards, credit, and wire transfers from. The requirements of economy exceed the ability of money. Thus, money was forced to alter, facilitating those needs. Okay, so we're at the point where money is now needed for exchange. So what do we use as money? Well, we've got a ton of old US currency lying around. We could use that. Of course, that's the problem. There's a ton of it. Why would I exchange any commodities for US dollars when it's simply lying around everywhere? A person would only need to raid a single store to collect more money than they would have gotten through a month of trading. If this is the case, it would make more economic sense to just scavenge money in the ruins of a city than to produce a commodity. It'd be far more profitable than production would be. So we see the problem. The supply of money vastly exceeds the demand for it. In a sense, it is mega hyperinflation to a degree unrivaled by anything in history. US dollars in this scenario would be literally worthless. A society cannot simply choose anything to be its currency. It must choose something that doesn't hinder, but serves the society's process of exchange. It is obvious that a free, abundant money commodity doesn't do the job. In fact, it outright sabotages it. Something else must be selected. There are some other legitimate reasons why the continuance of the US dollar would be a bad idea. The first issue is the fragile nature of bills. I'm sure they're made quite durable, but after 200 years, how well would they be holding up? How many of the bills would still be around after 2 centuries? US bills are really fabric, not paper. But even then, they wouldn't really last 200 years. Even if they did, they'd be too fragile to survive any reasonable amount of monetary velocity. The general everyday life in the wastelands is extremely physically harsh on all things. The conditions of this life would be much more severe than what US bills were originally intended for. The physical characteristics of the bill would be unsuitable for use. This is one reason why bottle caps were a good choice. They have a fairly high durability and their supply was about right for the level of the economy. One final aspect of pre-war money that I think is important is the very nature of the money itself. US dollars have a power and value because they are backed by the US government. Everyone around the world knows what a US dollar is worth and knows that it has worth because of the US government. It is a government that now no longer exists. The bills are worthless because they have no authority behind them, nor are they even particularly useful themselves. Pre-war money can't facilitate the requirements placed upon them. They lack the necessary durability and their supply is too great. If we're going to begin to understand how the followed economy works, we must first understand how economy works. How are the relations between people shaped by the production of commodities and their exchange? If we first understand how general capitalism works, we can then begin to understand how the differences within the Fallout economic universe operate. Fallout would not be much different than our modern-day capitalism in one particular regard. The wealth of those societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails presents itself as an immense accumulation of commodities, its unit being a single commodity. We must understand how we interact with each other economically, economic relations, in order to understand our social relations. But how does commodity production determine this? We can all see that money has power in society, but where exactly does it come from? More specifically, how do we Marxists see where the power of money comes from? There are many differing opinions on this in the world. The most famous one being the religious idea that money is the root of all evil, but of course this doesn't tell us very much. Money has power in society, but where does this power come from? The desire to obtain money is an end in itself. It takes on all things in society: class status, symbol of prestige, social power. It appears as though money has a power unto itself. Money seems to have a will and consciousness of its own. This phenomenon, where objects have social power or will of their own, is called the fetishism of commodities by Marx. In this context, Marx used the term fetishism in the original religious meaning. It is the view that inanimate objects hold power, or that these powers are attributed to them. Commodities and money can seem to have the same power, but they're really only expressions of our own labor. People produce things in a workplace. People directly interact with one another during their production. The organization of work, the division of labor, are direct social relations between people. When something needs to change in the process, someone from management walks in and tells everyone what is up, or a collective decision is made. This is different in the market. Instead, there are indirect social relations that are the exchange of commodities. The things that happen in the marketplace feed back to the act of production itself, i.e. make more, make less, make them differently, etc. Farmers, people who make cars, people who make furniture, interact through the marketplace when their products meet each other. We see only exchanges of value. These social relations are indirect, as they interact only through their commodities. In a single factory, we have material relations. In the marketplace, those material relations are replaced with a social relation between things. This process of social relations between people manifesting as relations between things, Marx calls reification. When we purchase a commodity, we are experiencing a commodity, not the social relations behind it. Even if we know that there is a network of social relations there, we still do not experience them. In this, we understand that every economic relation is experienced by a commodity. This act of exchanging all things in society is where money gets its power from. The value of all commodities is expressed through money. The social labor that goes into the production of certain commodity is expressed as a particular amount of money. As a result of this process of manufacture and exchange, money itself becomes the source of social power. The act of exchange gives it this power because it is an expression of social relations. The market is a collection of social relations. The more money you have, the more social power you have. Thus, we see the source of the power of money stems from the law of value. What writings Marx did give us with regards to money was that any money under capitalist commodity production had to be the product of labor. This means that money itself has to be a commodity before it can fulfill the role of money. If it was not, say it was something natural like shells, the money would have no value, as anyone could simply collect it up and use it. Past societies have used shells as currency, but these occurred under different historical circumstances. Under capitalism, a system of an immense accumulation of commodities, this simply would not do. Money has to be of some value produced outside of its natural value, meaning labor must be applied, creating that additional value, allowing it to function as money. Without it, we would have total anarchy, as money can appear without any measure of control. As a product of labor, gold, for instance, is created alongside the creation of value. As value expands, so does money itself. This functioning requires that money be the product of industrial capitalists, or in general the creation of value via labor, whose only motive is profit. This is one of the reasons why the central bank expands and contracts money according to the demand for money. Loans are created upon bookkeeping entry just for this reason. If you just produced money without regard to the production of commodities or value in the economy, you would end up with a problem. The idea of planning the money supply while leaving production to the anarchy of the profit system is indeed a hopeless contradiction. It should be noted, however, that we do face a contradiction with this in our modern real-life society. Often money is loaned out with no intention of creating commodities or the expansion of value, such as second or borrowed against mortgages. And in some cases, borrowing money to purchase or speculate on some already produced commodities. In Marx's time, he was referring to the production of gold. This process of making gold coins or bars requires labor be applied to the raw gold coming out of the ground. Physical commodity production creates value. As this value expanded, the money supply also expanded. This is how the money supply relatively regulated itself. This is not to say that there has never been an excess in the supply of gold, causing its price to fall. There have been moments when the British found large deposits of gold that dropped its price. The mining out of this gold caused the value of the gold-backed currency to fall. In the Fallout universe, there are several commodities used as money. The most common in use is bottle caps, also called caps. They too are a product of labor. At some point in the past, they were produced as a part of the Nuka-Cola product. Steel was stamped into a particular shape and then painted red and white. Their dominance as a currency came into effect via the hub merchants in the core region. They were chosen by the merchants because the technology for their manufacture was mostly lost in the Great War, which makes counterfeiting them very difficult. Secondly, they chose them because of their limited supply, which was meant to be a preservation of their value against inflation. These caps were backed by the value of water on the west coast of the former United States. On the east coast, or Fallout 3, there seems to be nothing that backs them and guarantees their value. Other currencies exist in the Fallout universe. The new California Republic created their own money by minting gold coins. Soon they started issuing notes that were backed by a gold standard. Eventually these coins came to dominate trade among the top 3 powers in existence: NCR, Vault City, and New Reno. This made bottle caps worthless. By 2281, the Brotherhood of Steel destroyed the NCR's gold reserves, causing their dollar to crash. Fortunately, the currency continued to have some value due to the fact that it was made out of gold. It caused the value to crash, with the exchange rate of a $100 bill being equal to 40 caps, rather than its face value, even in NCR territory and shops. This led to an exchange rate of 1 bottle cap for every 2.5 NCR dollars. Caesar's Legion, a large faction in Fallout New Vegas, has had its own currency. They also chose a valuable metallic currency. However, they decided upon bimetallism, where 2 precious metals would serve as money: the aureus, which is made out of gold, and the denarius, which is made out of silver. This precious metal standard, combined with the expensive trade, caused the currency to have great value despite the poor reputation of Caesar's Legion. The exchange rate is 4 bottle caps for every denarius, and 100 bottle caps to every aureus. There are other minor currencies in the universe as well. Brotherhood scripts are a currency used only among the Brotherhood of Steel. Ring pulls, or pull tabs from soda cans, are used as currency in Chicago, and a few places outside of it. These currencies don't play a major role in the game. Bottle caps remain the dominant currency dominating the Fallout universe. All of these currencies have one thing common: they are all products of labor. If a money is not the product of labor, then it has no value, nor does it have any use as money. As stated previously, Marx said that money had to be the product of labor in order for it to function as money. I also stated that Marx showed that the creation of money through industrial production, the creation of value, was the key to maintaining some force against inflation. This process expanded the money supply as value was created. This process is largely obsolete with our modern fiat currency. Now we have a relative estimate of how much money through the aforementioned mechanism is needed than it is produced. This process Marx was describing was money as a physical commodity, as money based on its value, not a fiat currency, which is based on its own value, not its own value, but the value an economy gives it and the supply of it that is determined. Fiat money has a value corresponding to its use and the authority that backs it. Gold has a value its physical self. The problem with bottle caps is that they are not produced anymore. This means that the money supply in caps does not correspond to the creation of value. Bottle caps have already been produced irrespective of production or the actual demand for them. Eventually, this would cause problems in an economy once it became sophisticated enough. When greater value is created, the supply of caps is not expanded correspondingly. This means that eventually there will not be enough bottle caps to allow the economy to function. Already counterfeit caps are not accepted as currency. How then would the supply of bottle caps expand? They are not the same thing as gold, where they have some supposedly intrinsic value. It's restricted supply, I say. The supply of caps must by necessity expand in order for the economy to expand. This requires someone to create new caps. Who is to be the one designated to do this? How many caps should be created? If these caps are created, some central authority must be doing it. If not, then anyone can just, take some metal and paint their own caps. I think you see the problem we're going to have here. Steel is relatively plentiful and paint can be found, if not just simply made. If just anyone can go around making caps, then why would anyone enter into production for profit collecting caps when they can just produce the caps themselves? If in our modern society we could just simply paint our own US dollars that were the same thing as government issued US dollars, because there's no law against counterfeiting or an authority to stop you, our economy would collapse very quickly. If no new caps are produced, then the economy cannot expand. At this point in the story of the Follow universe, the economy is not sophisticated enough in order to require such an expansion. Sooner or later, as time goes on, we'll see that happening. I'm certain that some might argue that this gap in the need for caps would be filled by other currencies in the game, particularly in New Vegas. I would argue that this is insufficient, as eventually these other currencies would come to dominate because the cap supply is limited. This would eventually cause the value of caps to crash and eventually become near or completely worthless. A single regulated currency is always a better choice over competing ones. This inability of caps to expand severely restricts the ability of the economy to expand. The large majority of industrial production involves borrowing money. Even large manufacturers like Ford and GM borrow money in order to enter a round of production. The capitalist takes out a loan from a bank that it uses to purchase the raw materials, pay bills for electricity and water, and cover the cost of wages for employees. The produced commodities are then sold on the market. The money collected from those sales is used to pay back the loan. What remains after the debts have been paid are profits. Could you imagine doing this with straight physical cash? Could you imagine the head of GM going down to the bank and taking out more than $100 million in bills? Of course not. There's no way that's going to happen. In reality, money would be created upon bookkeeping entry and then electronically transferred to wherever it needed to go. Imagine you actually did have the physical money. How difficult would that be to move around? Modern investment in production could not work with a single physical-only currency. So we see the problem here. The supply of caps and the management of them as a currency are insufficient for any serious investment. It would be impossible for a sophisticated economy to operate with them. This is why money has evolved in the manner that it has in the real world. Gold coins as money has ceased to function in a manner which the evolution of capitalism requires of it. The movement of commodities, determined by the mode of production, has a requirement money is unable to fulfill. This is why money as a medium through which commodity exchange takes place, a medium that transmits, but in most cases does not create impulses of spending that originate outside itself. Money is subservient to the needs of the capitalist and his system, not the other way around. The relationship is dialectical, of course, but the dominant moment, in dialectics terms, is the requirements of the mode of production itself. This is how Marx explained the relationship. Production and consumption appear as moments of a process in which production is the actual point of departure, and hence also the dominant moment. The act epitomizing the entire process. That exchange and consumption cannot be dominant moments is self-evident. And The same applies to distribution as the distribution of products. A definite mode of production thus determines a definite mode of consumption, distribution, and exchange, and define relations of these different moments to one another. Production in its one-sided form, that is, considered only as a moment, however, is in its turn also determined by other movements. For example, if the market, i.e. the sphere of exchange, expands, production grows in volume and becomes more differentiated. Changes in distribution, example, concentration of capital, different distribution of the population in town and country, and the like, entail changes in production. Lastly, production is determined by the needs of consumption. There is an interaction between different moments. This is the case in any organic entity. The reality of this situation is that as society began to rebuild and capitalism took its natural path of evolution, caps would cease to be effective as money. By necessity, something else would have to take its place. Eventually, along the way, we could expect a Great Depression type situation where the inflexibility of caps would trigger an economic crisis. This would force anyone with economic knowledge to recognize that a new currency would be needed. If this factionalization we see with Fallout New Vegas continued, each group would have to manage this problem itself. The unique context of having multiple currencies makes it very difficult to analyze. An interesting effect of this, I think, would be the astronomical amount of economic power that the casinos would have. It's here we run into the problem of a fictional universe. For any casino to achieve consistent profitability, there would have to be at least a relatively developed capitalist economy, meaning there must be a particular degree of disposable income for people. I doubt this would be all that common given the material conditions of the Fallout universe. However, for the sake of argument, we'll assume that there is, because the casinos operate just fine in the game. These casinos would be obvious cash cows that could generate large amounts of money with little in the way of operating costs. I believe this is so given the nature of the Fallout universe as opposed to real life. Just via gambling alone, an incredible amount of caps could be collected. This is very much unlike the commodity production which takes in money per product produced. These casinos, on the other hand, can have a large increase of money come in with little to no increase in expenditures. All a gambling table has to do is accept the chips that come in. This would allow the business's store of caps to grow quite large. Now, because credit does not exist, only physical currency does. A casino would hold quite a lot of power. These casinos would be in a prime position to invest in production because they have the physical money available to do so. No one else would have a collection of money large enough ahead of the production of value in order to be able to invest. Any enterprising casino owner would recognize this easily and begin investing. The power of investment would lie in the hands of casino owners. This advantage alone would lead to them dominating production and eventually the entire economy. The irony here is that casinos do not generate value, but they would collect the money necessary to begin physical commodity production that does. As I previously mentioned, money operates in a historical context, which places certain demands upon it. As capitalism develops and goes through all the phases of its evolution, eventually there will come a point when financial capital begins to form. This kind of operation requires certain behaviors that certain forms of money are not able to perform. This is the moment when money itself must be modified by society to fulfill its new function, or there will be a halt to the evolution of the capitalist system. One prime example of this is the moment when financial capital appears in society. This is a historically unique function that appears in no mode of production preceding capitalism. What is this unique function? Allow me to explain. Capitalism is in its very essence a system of commodity exchange through the private ownership of the means of production. Everything that is socially required of society is produced through this method. The very fact that something can be sold for money is confirmation that the individual conditions for the production of the commodities coincides with the general conditions of social production. The purpose of its manufacture and exchange is to satisfy individual wants in the general exchange of commodities. Money used in this strictly exchange sense follows a circuit of capital Marx laid out. CMC. A commodity is produced, then sold for money. That money is then used to purchase another commodity. What money does is allows the value of one commodity to be exchanged for another. Money fulfills the transitory period in which value is exchanged for another. Money, acting as a form of value, is always a temporary transition phase of the exchange of values. For the industrial producer of commodities, the circuit of capital is different, MCM prime. First, money is collected then invested in production of commodities. These commodities are then sold for a greater amount of money than they were produced. What is different here from the last circuit is that the commodity is produced merely for the purpose of collecting more money. The capitalist isn't particularly interested in exchanging for other values. He's interested in unloading the ones his production has produced for more money than he invested in them. Money is now a means to its own end. We have now gone from simple commodity production to capitalist commodity production. The last form I will be discussing here is the finance capital circuit, MM prime. Well, this seems pretty simple. You take an amount of money, invest it, and it comes back as more money. This is one reason why some people don't particularly like bankers and investors. They don't do anything productive. They just give out money to whomever they think will give them the best return. Once that happens, they sit back and watch the returns grow. Seems kind of unfair, right? A person can profit off of production without themselves having gone in and done any work. What we're seeing here is the social manifestations of the relations of production. The mere ownership of money and or capital places the capitalist in a position where he is relieved from having to work. This is in line perfectly with what we talked about in the Fallout 3 video. So long as the productivity of labor remains at a level one man can produce enough for his own subsistence, social division does not take place, and any social differentiation within a society is impossible. Under these conditions, all men are producers, and they are all on the same economic level. Every increase in the productivity of labor beyond this low point makes a small surplus possible. And once there is a surplus of products, once a man's two hands can produce more than is needed for his own subsistence, then the conditions have been set for a struggle over how this surplus will be shared. Whenever this situation arises, a section of the society can become a ruling class, whose outstanding characteristic is its emancipation from the need of working for its own subsistence. These people, in this particular position in the relations of production, essentially exploit that position for gain. This class of people holds power of investment and decides who receives the money for production to take place. Society must by necessity produce the commodities that people require. The people in this position are exploiting the fact that society must produce. This affords them a great deal of power over how the productive forces of society are used. They can decide based on profit maximization where money goes and what commodities in society are produced up to a certain point. Given the global nature of finance, we can see why money is invested in military hardware for the imperialist war machine and not in food for the world hungry. In their logic, why put money into hungry people which pretty much can't make a return when you can put it into weapons manufacturing? Often, this is misunderstood as some kind of corruption, the unethical act of some capitalist, or just plain human nature. No. As we have just seen, it resides in the very structure of capitalism itself. It by necessity must invest in something profitable, if not in the most profitable place it can find. This kind of inhumanity of weapons over food is not some aberrant behavior. It is the very nature of the capitalist system, a system of private ownership of the means of production for profit itself. So, with all this having been said, what is the problem with bottle caps here? What aspect of bottle caps is a hindrance to this process? Many different forms of money can produce different difficulties with it. We are, however, restricting our investigation to merely caps. The initial one I see is their limited supply, which I spoke about previously. Any real large production requires a tremendous amount of investment capital. This could be augmented somewhat if you use slaves. Collecting enough caps ahead of production would be a monumental, if not outright impossible task. The ability of financial institutions or an investment bank to operate would be impossible. As we're well aware, banks don't carry an amount of physical currency equal to all the money it has. Out of necessity, fiat non-physical currency is needed. By this, of course, I am referring to money that exists as numbers on a computer. It is entirely impractical to physically carry or even store that much money. Okay, so we're clear that moving several million bottle caps is horribly inefficient, even if that amount of caps were even in existence within reach of these hypothetical economic actors. I'm sure that there are millions upon millions of caps in the United States, but these would no doubt be spread across the entire country. By the time anyone scavenged enough of them, they would have already been dead for years. This could very well be applied to any gold currency. Not gold-backed, but physically gold. I don't fancy moving hundreds, let alone millions of gold coins around. Transportation costs, even without including security, would be absurd. The same problem would appear here if we were to investigate the possibilities of beginning a stock market. The velocity of money in such a situation is astronomical and far beyond the abilities of a physical currency. Caps would by necessity have to be electronic in order for them to move fast enough. One alteration of the function of caps that could facilitate a primitive version of this function is a paper representation of them. Instead of, say, carrying 400 caps around with you, you could place those caps in a bank and be issued a piece of paper that says they're there. That piece of paper could be taken to wherever and then traded for whatever was going to be purchased. At some point in the future, the person who accepted the paper could take that to the bank and then withdraw the caps, or a partial amount, and receive a new piece of paper along with them. This is a very similar route to what was taken with gold. The problem with this plan is that, to date, there are no banks in any of the Fallout games. These financial actions cannot take place due to the nature of caps themselves. Caps fulfill a historically necessary role in the Fallout universe. Once economy expanded beyond this historical level, the currency would have to change. I would think, given what limited knowledge we have of the Fallout universe, that caps would end up taking a similar route to gold. Again, it's very difficult to predict what would happen because these caps exist in a society with other competing currencies in New Vegas. Barring any unforeseen events, gold would most likely have to take their place. We can plainly see that caps would make financial investment frankly impossible on any serious level. In the storyline of the Fallout universe in the core region, the relative scarcity of bottle caps made them a perfect currency for hub merchants to adopt in the 22nd century, leading to the nickname hubbucks or hub script. Backed by the value of water, the hub merchants supported bottle caps because the technology to manufacture them and paint their surfaces had been mostly lost in the Great War, which limited any number of counterfeiting efforts. Secondly, there are a limited number of bottle caps which preserve their value against inflation to some degree. For similar reasons, the East Coast merchants also recognize bottle caps as a currency, although who or what backs them and guarantees their value is unknown. The idea of having a currency backed by clean water is an interesting concept. Of course, all money must have some kind of backing to some degree or another. Marx said that it must be a product of labor. Others propound the idea that money must be backed by gold. And today, the money we have is backed by the authority of the U.S. government. The idea of using clean water is, on the surface, it seems like a good idea. I mean, if you're going to back a currency with a valuable commodity, you can't get any more valuable than clean water in a post-apocalyptic world. The lakes and rivers of the world are highly irradiated, making them basically poison. If there is a commodity that backs a currency, then that currency must be exchangeable for it. A gold-backed dollar was redeemable in gold. Presumably in the core region where this standard is held, caps can be exchanged for water. According to some online sources, a single cap was worth a single liter of water. This was supposedly set by water merchants who determined its value. So we can presume that a cap can be exchanged somewhere in the core region for clean water. I think this implies some kind of clean water bank where that exchange can be made. Unfortunately, I have no knowledge as to whether this is true or not. On the whole, I'd have to say that a water standard is a bad idea. Sure, water would be far more valuable than gold in the Fallout universe for two reasons. One, the supply of clean water is limited given the lack of infrastructure. And two, unlike gold, water is an absolute necessity for life. In this regard, society couldn't pick a more valuable commodity. The problem, which I think makes it unusable as a backing for currency, is the fact that clean water is a commodity that can be destroyed. By this, I mean that once you drink the water, its value has ceased to exist. That cap no longer has that value backing it. What kind of currency has a value that can be consumed? The advantage of gold is in its physical properties. It can be melted down, but it's not destroyed. Whatever you do with gold, it will still be there. The very purpose of water is to be drunk. Once you drink the water that backs that cap, then what? Does that cap cease to exist? The value behind that cap does. If you do, how did the person that you exchange with know that that cap no longer has any water value? This would mean that the commodity backing the currency is inherently flawed. Gold is useful as money in a historical context, but that can become obsolete with the expansion of economy. But water is just an outright self-destructive and suicidal as a backing of value. A water standard is a horrible idea. The Fallout universe doesn't afford us much in the way of the use of money. Post-apocalyptic society does not afford us all the interesting dynamics that we see in our everyday real life. There are no stock markets, no Wall Street, no complex financial instruments to speak of. The productive forces are not developed to the level of a modern capitalist society. Thus, the money in the system is equally underdeveloped. What it does have is rather interesting. While the productive forces are underdeveloped, there are some advanced aspects. The existence of casinos in New Vegas is an oddity, as it does not fit in with the rest of the economy. It is a product of an advanced one. This is, of course, the result of the leftover influence of the pre-war society. We must keep in mind that in this world, they are not developing, they are redeveloping. The general ideas of a more advanced society are known. They are not discovering them for the first time. Reality shows us that there would have to be a monetary policy in place eventually. As society developed new requirements, there would be, necessary changes in money. We see from the examples here in Fallout, as well as in real life, that the Marxist conception of money adequately explains many of the economic relations.